Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series, sponsored by the Administration for Community Living and hosted by the American Society on Aging. My name is Julia Burrows. I am the program coordinator with ASA, and we are glad to have you with us. We will be getting started in just a moment, but before we do, we have a few housekeeping things. The slides for today's presentation are available under the tab on your screen labeled Resources. You will also see a tab labeled CE Application here. You'll find the information on how to obtain CE credit for this event. You have 60 days to complete a continuing education application, and it may take up to 30 days from the date of your application for us to process and issue your CE credit. If you are not logged into this webinar directly, that is, if you're watching as part of a group and did not log in using an individualized confirmation URL, you will not be eligible for continuing education credit because we have no way of tracking your online attendance. You would need to register using your own email address and then watch via that confirmation URL. If you have any questions during today's presentation, you can send those to us at any time using the questions box, and we'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's programs to answer those. I would now like to welcome and turn it over to Sari Schumann of the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar, Beyond One Size Fits All, Addressing the Needs of People Living with Dementia and Their Caregivers in Asian American and Persian American Communities. The National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series is supported by the Administration for Community Living. Before we start the presentation, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide a brief welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for our very important webinar today on serving Asian American and Persian American communities. We're very proud to have Sarah and Amy's organizations in ACL's Alzheimer's Disease Programs Initiative Grant Program, and are excited to learn with you about all of the great work that they're doing. Thanks again so much, and back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Erin. Today's presenters are Amy Phillips and Sarah Kachina. Amy Phillips is the Director of Program Administration at the Little Tokyo Service Center, a nonprofit social services and community development agency in Los Angeles, California. She has more than 20 years' experience providing services, particularly to older adults and those with low income, starting with her roots as a bilingual case manager, then as Little Tokyo Service Center's Director of Senior Services and co-chair of the Asian and Pacific Islander Older Adults Task Force. Sarah Kachina is the Program Director and Program Manager of the Orange County Initiative to support special populations impacted by Alzheimer's disease and related disorders grant funded through the Administration for Community Living. Sarah is also an Associate Marriage and Family Therapist with a Master's degree in Marriage and Family Therapy. She has more than 12 years of clinical experience working with diverse populations of immigrant families, specifically older adults. I will turn the presentation over now to Amy and Sarah, and Amy will start us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I want to thank ASA, ACL, and NADRC for allowing us to share about our communities and the programs that we're adapting for the Asian American and Persian American communities. So just a little bit about Little Tokyo Service Center. Well, actually, let me start with our learning objectives. We hope today, for my part of the presentation, I'd like to share the diversity of Asian American communities and to try to identify some of the common barriers that Asian Americans face as people try to seek services in general, but especially with dementia-specific services. And we hope that you pick up some points for consideration when adapting dementia services for Asian American populations. And of course, we want to talk a little bit about approaches to increase access and care. So Little Tokyo Service Center has been around for over 40 years. and we have different levels of services that we focus on, individual and families, also at the neighborhood level, and much broader as we try to preserve cultural heritage and add to the colorful, rich history of the Los Angeles area in particular. And we started off in the Little Tokyo neighborhood of downtown Los Angeles, but we go all over Los Angeles County wherever there is a language or cultural need, and that's true for our social services, where we do a lot of outreach and education, but also case management and counseling services. We serve all ages. So we have programs for children and families and parenting groups, and we go all the way up to older adults and caregivers as well. And we provide our services in English and Japanese originally, but as our neighborhood has changed and as the needs around us have changed, we also have social workers who speak Korean, Cantonese, Mandarin, and Spanish. Other things that Little Tokyo Service Center does include community development, in particular affordable housing, which is just an ongoing issue, historic preservation and community spaces, and child development and even small business development, which has been a very big need in our communities during the pandemic. So I want to share a little bit about demographic trends in the Asian American community. And for the last two census, the 2010 census and the 2020 census, we've seen data show that Asian Americans are actually the fastest growing racial group in the country. That doesn't mean it's the largest minority group, but it is the fastest growing. And the majority of Asian Americans are immigrants. More than 60%, in fact, have immigrated to the United States. And for a long time, Japanese were the only Asian ethnic group that were majority American-born. Actually, I've seen some data that shows that the Hmong community is now very slightly majority Asian American-born. But even in the Japanese American community, nearly a quarter report having a hard time with English. And there are still more than a third of the Japanese American households where they speak more than one language in the household. So, we think about the Asian American community. We don't have time to go into the whole history of Asian immigration to the U.S., but I think it's important to realize that many, especially older adults, really are monolingual or have a very difficult time with English even today. I think there's a perception or image of Asian Americans tending to be very well educated and things like that, which is true for some Asian ethnic groups, but even still, the majority of the population does have a hard time with English. And this category of Asian American is very, very broad. It's increasingly diverse. There are more than 20 different countries that the Census Bureau recognizes as countries of origin, and there are more than 30 languages, and even more if you include the very distinct dialects. So even within the same country, people may not communicate the same way. And then when they come to the U.S., they may have different backgrounds, different cultural practices that they bring with them. And then also we're seeing a lot of intermarriage as well. So the community, or a lot of times we think of ourselves as Asian American communities, plural, may have a lot of similarities, but is also increasingly diverse. And in Los Angeles County, we have some data that's specific to older adults. We were fortunately able to work with AARP, which funded a study that was done by Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And we looked at older adults in the LA area, and more than 15% are of Asian ancestry. And in fact, we found, when we disaggregate the data, we found some very specific characteristics. For example, we looked at the poverty rates of older adults in Los Angeles County and broke it down. We found that Koreans have the highest poverty rate of all ethnic groups in LA County, followed by Cambodian. And in the Korean American and Cambodian American communities, I think people don't really think, again, of Asian Americans as having those kinds of economic challenges, but in fact, it is the highest rate of poverty. And then number 4 was Chinese, and I think number 5 was Vietnamese. So of the top 5 ethnic groups, racial and ethnic groups with the highest poverty rates, 4 of the 5 were Asian populations. And then for the Japanese American community, it kind of is similar. We see something that's similar to Japan itself, where the average age of the Japanese American population in LA County, actually in all of the nation, is the oldest average age. And in fact, 1 in 5 people in the Japanese American community are over the age of 65. So we, for the populations that we, Little Tokyo Service Center, serves, we have some challenges in terms of just poverty and economic security, and then just the sheer number of older adults in our population. So it's already challenging to support older loved ones without extended family around. If you're an immigrant community, you may not have all of your family living right next to you because you've immigrated, and also your family may be in the country of origin. And when you add in Alzheimer's disease or other related dementias, taking care of our older adults may sometimes feel like this, right? That we're caring for our elders who we love and respect, and it may feel like there's not a lot of resources around in order to do that. So some challenges for Asian Americans for accessing services. That diversity of language and culture and history can be a big issue. Not just getting the services we need in a particular language, but even this concept of Asian American, it's really a political term, especially for our older adults. They didn't come to the U.S. with a Pan-Asian identity. They think of themselves even now as, Korean or Korean American, or Japanese American, or Chinese and Chinese American, or more specific to their region even. And so, when they came to the United States, not only did they become American, they also became Asian, because in a lot of ways, in the U.S., we kind of lump all the Asian ethnicities together. I have, unfortunately, in my over 20 years of experience serving Asian Americans, have talked to service providers, funders, and even people from government agencies who say, "Oh, does your staff speak Asian? Do you speak Asian?" And I'm going, "Gosh, there's no Asian language. There are many Asian languages." So I'm always responding saying, "Oh yes, we have staff who speak many different Asian languages," and I think that's a conception that's very hard for our older adults in particular to have to explain. Oh, I have a very specific language need, or they feel very invisible because they're not understood. And so our populations are often considered hard to reach and are underserved. There are those linguistic and cultural barriers. It's just hard to find resources available in the languages that they're most proficient in. And there aren't a lot of resources or even flyers and things to tell us about the local senior center or meal programs or things like that in the languages that we need. And then there are also cultural barriers, like just the stigma of asking for help. And I think that's true across many different ethnicities. It's not unique to Asian American communities, but there is a very strong sense of keeping things within the family, and sometimes it's overemphasized, but there is definitely a sense of shame in having to ask for help. Another issue that we see a lot is that mainstream providers might not be aware of the very specific needs that are in the community. And this is not a knock on our colleagues who are serving in the field of aging, but I think there are times when our neighborhoods change around us. That's true for us as well, even in Little Tokyo. The neighborhood around us changes, and we have to make adjustments for those changes, but that can be really hard, and there aren't always enough resources to even to pick up on some of those changes, let alone change our services to meet them. And so a lot of times we hear from Asian American seniors and caregivers trying to access services saying, I feel very invisible. And actually there are times, I think, when maybe service providers might imply that culture, the cultural difference is a barrier, and that it's maybe the senior's own fault for not being more proactive in letting go of their culture. And I really want to emphasize culture as sort of a tool that we use to understand and interpret the behavior of others in our everyday lives. And it helps us to determine how we're supposed to respond, right? So, when we think of culture as a tool, you have, say, like a hammer and a screwdriver, right? And we might have a specific bias that says the hammer is always the best tool for, getting the nail into a board and keeping the two boards together. But there might be another kind of tool, like a screw and a screwdriver, right? And in a different context, a screwdriver might be more appropriate than using a hammer. But sometimes I hear comments that imply that a screwdriver doesn't exist, or shouldn't exist. And I think for a lot of Asian Americans or ethnic minority communities in general, there's a lot of, I think you might hear the term code switching, where we have to learn to use the hammer and the screwdriver. And I think that that's a very useful thing for all service providers to have to really think about as we go forward in planning services and thinking about how we can increase access for our increasingly diverse communities. So I want to give an example where I think sometimes we might inadvertently exclude without realizing that we're doing it. So maybe in a senior center, here are some things that in a traditional senior center would be very innocuous. It's common, right? We have a macaroni and cheese might be something we serve at lunchtime, or a meatloaf, or maybe one of the popular games might be bingo. But a lot of Asian Americans are lactose intolerant. They'll see the mac and cheese and think, I really can't eat that. So that's out for them. Or maybe something like meatloaf, right? For some, that might be considered haram, right? If you're Muslim, which is basically for a lot of Muslims, you need to have, for all Muslims, I should say, practicing Muslims, they need their food to be halal, which is kind of like a Muslim equivalent to kosher, if you're familiar with that. The food must be prepared a certain way in order to be able to eat it. Or if you're vegetarian, as many Buddhists or Hindu are, then you can't eat meatloaf, right? So then that's out. Or even something like bingo, which you think is kind of universal. In some cultures, it might be considered gambling. And so that's out. So there are all these things that we think of, that are everyday things that we think are totally non-controversial, but it might inadvertently be signaling to certain cultures or older adults that they're not welcome, or this is a place that that is inaccessible to them. They may be totally aware of the senior center, but see what's there and say, oh, this is not for me, I can't participate, or I can't access this resource. And it might be totally unintentional and unconscious. So even the things that we think of as very normal and non-controversial, we might need to re-examine when we are planning and preparing services that are accessible to others. I just want to briefly touch on another issue that's really come up in the last 2 years, the anti-Asian sentiments, especially during COVID. And in Little Tokyo, there's one senior apartment in the Little Tokyo Towers where about 500 residents, mostly Korean, some Japanese and Chinese, live. And right next door is a Japanese Buddhist temple, Higashi Honganji Temple. And last February, at the time I prepared this slide, it was still the most recent February. But yeah, so last year, February, it was vandalized. And I think for the seniors, it was just shocking to see that somebody set fire and knocked over things. And we've had instances in Little Tokyo where some of our seniors were pushed down or yelled at or spat at and things. And, it creates a sense of fear and makes it that much harder to seek services. So, continuing on this theme of challenges, because there are fewer educational materials, fewer activities, and fewer referral resources, it does affect the well-being of the seniors that we're trying to serve. And we know that culturally specific resources are helpful and are protective factors for memory. There was a study done in the Seattle area Japanese American community known as the Kame study. Kame means turtle in Japanese. And they found that the Japanese Americans who participated in culturally appropriate or activities that use Japanese, they had a slower rate of cognitive decline compared to others who are in mainstream services. So we know that this is something that's very important, but there's just not a lot available. And there's been a lot of emphasis on evidence-based practices, which are really good. We want to make sure that our practices are backed up by evidence, but most of those programs are not developed in or for ethnic minority populations. They may not always get tested on the communities that we serve. And there might be a certain level of rigidity. We want to maintain fidelity, of course. But in fact, most of these EBPs can't be used as they are for a lot of ethnic minority communities. We need to have the time and ability to adapt those so that it becomes relevant and more accessible and gives the same protective factors for the communities that we serve. So when we're serving Asian American elders, and a lot of this so far is not so dementia specific. It's something that's true for Asian Americans who, in order to serve Asian American seniors in general. But providing in-language support is one of the most important things because it increases understanding and comprehension, communication, and that's especially important when working with somebody who may have some cognitive decline. It promotes a sense of inclusion. They feel like they're welcomed. They feel like this service is for them rather than feeling alienated or othered by it. And it also helps the person to speak more freely. We've had instances where we might call adult protective services to go check on a person who has some cognitive issues, and they speak a couple of words of English, and the APS worker says, oh, they seem fine. But actually, if we speak to them in their language, like if I talk to them in Japanese, they might share more about their struggles and things like that, where they may not have the words to share what's going on in English. I think one other thing to be very careful when providing in-language support is to not immediately assume that a family member or a neighbor or somebody from church can be the translator. It's important to have a, as much as possible, professional or third-party translator, because it's very hard to ask the senior to talk about some of these really things they might feel are shameful in front of, say, their children or grandchildren, or some of these ethnic communities are very small. When you have the pastor translating, you can't help but wonder, like, will everybody in my congregation be hearing about this tomorrow? So then it makes it very hard for the person to speak freely. Another reason why in-language support is very important with those with ADRD is we've been seeing that in some cases that people regress to their primary language or their first language as their cognitive issues increase. And so we find that where they may have been able to communicate with their American-born family or caregivers or service providers in the past, that becomes increasingly difficult. And so assessing that language and level of acculturation of the family members is very important as well. We want to take into account that in a lot of Asian cultures, in Japanese and Korean, there may be an indirect communication style. Actually, Japanese probably has a much more indirect communication style than, say, Korean or Chinese even, where somebody might nod and say yes out of deference to authority to you as a social service provider, when in fact they're thinking, I'm not so sure I can follow through with this thing that we're talking about. And then another big issue is to think about the goal of independence. I think a lot of times for us in America, we're thinking about getting somebody to a point of independence where they can live on their own or continue to live on their own. And that may not always be the goal in Asian American families. The goal might be a restoration of the family connections, and that might be what we as service providers need to focus on. So a word about translations. I want to just point out literal translations often don't make practical sense. We want to have things in multiple languages and translated, but sometimes professional translators aren't familiar with the specific terminology, and that might be especially true with Alzheimer's. There are some words or concepts that might be just completely absent in some languages. So even the word dementia, as we were trying to translate this, we found that the most commonly used in Korean is based on the word crazy, which we do not want to use that when we're talking about dementia. So, it might be that we need to find different words to describe these things. And then, there are times when a technical term might be correct, but is inappropriate for the target population. So there is a word in Japanese for caregiver, but it usually implies that the person is a paid caregiver. And the things that family members do, they might be doing the exact same thing as a paid caregiver, but they would never ever use that term to describe what they are doing. So we have to think about how we're going to communicate some of this information to our families. There are very specific things, about, in the U.S. we think of I statements as empowering, but that is not necessarily the case in Asian cultures. And when we translate things, we really hope to make things bilingual, because maybe the second and third generations born in the U.S. might not be able to read in that language. And if we have side-by-side language materials, then that makes it more accessible for the whole family to participate. So how do we move from this, feeling like this, to feeling more like this? So very quickly, our ACL-funded Alzheimer's and Dementia Program Initiative grant is titled Enhancing Dementia Capability in the Los Angeles Area API Community. We use API as a shorthand because, it's hard to name every single different thing, but I want to acknowledge that a lot of times API is used when we really only mean Asian American, and Pacific Islander is kind of an afterthought. So I really think PIs need to have their own programs and projects. So For this presentation, we're sticking with Asian American because that is in fact more what we're doing in our adaptation. Our English language services, of course, include any Asian and Pacific Islander. Little Tokyo Service Center is a lead agency, primarily focusing on Japanese and Korean services, but we're working with Alzheimer's Los Angeles, which is focusing on English and Mandarin. Of course, we're all working together on all the languages. And we have an evaluator, Kyung-hee Chi, who is at Texas State University. And so what we had hoped to see with this is really focusing on developing useful vocabulary and developing resources that would then reduce stigma in our respective communities, create more supportive activities, increase our dementia capability, and ultimately encourage families to seek support sooner, because what we're seeing is because of that shame, because they don't know about services, people might really delay getting help. And by the time they are looking for help, maybe the person with dementia is not able to, may not have the capacity to give consent or develop a advanced health care directive and things like that. So we really, really are hoping to see people come in and ask for services sooner. So I should say, we don't have a lot of data yet. We've done a bunch of presentations and more than 100 respondents who have, we've seen like a 15% increase in people saying they feel more confident about being able to identify symptoms of dementia, and we see that we're heading in the right direction, but we're still early in our services, so we hope to be able to share data in the future, maybe at an ASA conference. So a lot of the approaches that I have on these slides, I think they're things that are true for any ethnic community. But building a rapport is extremely important when serving Asian Americans. And again, developing maybe what you might feel is sort of too euphemistic, but a vocabulary that emphasizes education and wellness rather than receiving help. So there might be things like, we use the term support group in English, but sometimes in Asian language we might translate that to or explain it as it's a monthly class to learn about. So the empowering part is that you're gaining some knowledge rather than going to a quote-unquote support group. Or even a term like counseling, we say, would you like to talk to a person who's trained to listen? As opposed to saying, we really suggest counseling or therapy. And of course, following up, it's important to build that trust. And another thing I really want to highlight is to leave room for reciprocity. For a lot of Asian cultures, it's hard to ask for help if you're always receiving and you aren't able to give something back as well. So I think that part can be used to help motivate change. And when we want change, it's important probably to focus on changing behavior, not the thinking or the feelings first. It is much easier for a lot of our seniors to talk about what they can do to address the dementia and make some changes, and to start doing some activities together. And then from that point on, maybe be able to talk about some of the insecurities they feel. So the main thing, even though I've talked about the Asian American, certain Asian American populations and certain cultural points, the main thing really is that the client is the expert. When they came to the U.S., they might have chosen to leave certain cultural practices behind or have integrated, and therefore, they will tell you what they need and don't need. And it's very important to just sit and listen. So there are some additional references and resources you can have when you download the slides. But again, the contact information for LTSC and our partner agency, Alzheimer's LA, and then the link to the report from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which has a whole series of demographic reports by Asian Americans if you're interested. Thank you. I hand it over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar. I just wanted to take a minute to actually thank ACL and NADRC and ASA for this opportunity to present on the Persian American communities. We were really grateful for this grant because, as Amy mentioned, in our communities, we were never able to access any resources. Not any resources in Farsi existed in the Persian community. So we basically became a pioneer for this type of work with dementia care. Just briefly, I wanted to let you know who Omid is. Omid started in 2011. We're fairly new as a nonprofit organization that primarily was providing mental health services to the underserved community. But soon after, we actually saw the need for a lot of social services, community programs, especially with the aging population. Omid has done many services for the senior community. As I mentioned, the Positive Aging Program existed for us. The Early Intervention Services for older adults that are isolated is another grant that we have been working with the County of Orange. We are located in Orange County, California. The objectives for this presentation in specific will be that you will learn who the Persian Americans are, guidelines for culturally sensitive services delivery and why it matters in dementia care, adaptation of culturally appropriate resource material process and how we came about that, and lastly, success and challenges with providing services in a specific dementia care to this population. The name of our ACL project is Orange County Initiative to Support Special Populations Impacted by Alzheimer's Disease. This special population was Persian communities and Latinx communities, but for the sake of this presentation, we're sticking to the Persian communities. Our partner organization in the project is Alzheimer's of Orange County, but mainly providing education, training to 5 of Omid staff over the past 2 years. It's a 3-year project, and we're right now in the 2nd year of our project. And in this project, we had an aim of serving 4 categories. So the first category that we were serving, is persons living with dementia that are alone or at risk. Our outcome goal for this population was to enroll and serve about 40 individuals with the goal of improving the quality of life of the vulnerable target population. The second category that we are serving are the caregivers, in specific Persian caregivers, and our outcome goal was to increase caregiver skills, improve level of care, and also reduce of burden and stress in the caregiver category. The third population was the gatekeepers and the culturally based organizations that we wanted to train. We had a goal of 10 organizations to train. Usually these are the people that come in contact first with the at-risk population. And we mainly wanted to train the gatekeepers to basically recognize signs and symptoms of early memory loss and possibly dementia and refer to us and Alzheimer's Orange County for further assessment. And the last category was the community at large. At Omid, we really believe in educating the public, providing free classes, free psychoeducational classes to basically increase in dementia-capable communities. And in order to do that, we basically provided a lot of free Dementia Friends education, a lot of brain health education, and so on. Now, I just want to talk about a little bit why culture is so important, whether we're dealing with any type of health issue, mental health issue, in a specific dementia care. Culture usually shapes how healthcare information is received, how symptoms and concern about the problem are expressed, how rights and protections are exercised, who should provide treatment for the problem, and what is considered to be a health problem. Then what type of treatment should be given. An example I can use very easily here for you is that if you're working with dementia and dementia care, we all know that it's already hard to try to explain that dementia is not a normal part of aging. Now, with our population, it's actually kind of harder because it's just traditionally and culturally, Persians have been set in their ways that, you know, as we age, we lose our memory. So this is why I had these little bullet points for you, and what culture really means. So, and why is it so important in dementia care? When we speak about culture, I want to emphasize that culture refers to an integrated pattern of human behavior that includes language, thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and in general, an institution of racial, ethnic, religious, and social groups. So as Amy mentioned, it's really important to understand that cultural competency or being culturally responsive is just really more than being linguistically competent. I have experience of working with a lot of mainstream organizations in South Orange County that they think they can basically hire a Farsi-speaking care manager, and then at that point, their organization is now culturally competent. So this is why I just put all the definition of culture in here for you, and why it really does matter when we're thinking about beliefs, values, customs, and religion in this population. I just want to briefly tell you about who Persian Americans are. The word Persian, Iranian is basically the same. It's just the two words are used interchangeably. So if you hear Persian or Iranian, they are the same. Persians or Iranians are specifically from Iran. I say this with a little emphasis because usually when we're talking about the Middle Eastern population, the minute that you have a client coming into your office and they say I'm Persian and you ask them, well, what country are you from? They're all from Iran. Now, they do speak other languages. There has been an estimate that about 300,000 to 1 million Persian Americans are in the United States. As you can see, there's a huge discrepancy between this number, and that's huge because up until 2020, Iranian American did not even exist as a checkbox on the U.S. Census. So we're seeing an increase of people reporting themselves and their ethnicities on there. There's an estimate about 160,000 Iranians in California. And I just briefly want to tell you about the history of immigration, and I'll explain why this matters in the next slides in terms of providing care to this population. So for the sake of this presentation, obviously we don't want to overgeneralize, but we have divided the Persian immigrants into 3 categories. So there's a category of Iranians that basically immigrated to the United States after the post-1979 revolution. These are very highly educated individuals. They were university professors. They were elite groups. They're more affluent in terms of socioeconomic status. Then from 1980 to 2001, during the Iran-Iraq War, whoever else could get out of Iran did. So these people also have a lot of resources. Now, from 2001 to present, there have been a lot of lottery recipients, and these are the populations that to us are considered hard to reach and underserved. So compared to the other 2 previous groups, they are basically more at need. They are not as highly educated. Like I said, we're not overgeneralizing, but for the sake of this presentation, we put in these three categories. But in general, Iranians or Persians are a very highly educated ethnic group. They also have a really high intra-group diversity. What I mean by that is that you will see in America that there are Persians that are Muslim, there are Persians that are Jewish, there are Persians that are Christian, Zoroastrian. In terms of language, the main language that Persians speak is Farsi. However, there could be Persians that speak Armenian, Turkish, Kurdish, and so on and so forth. So when working with a client that comes to your office, if you are a mainstream organization or a community-based organization, it would be really important to kind of not assume. Always go in with an open mind, ask them what they practice, who they are, when did they come to America, what is the history of immigration, because all of that matters. I just have a quick little slide that shows you compared to other all other immigrants, the age group of the 65 and over, which we consider older adults and seniors, in Iranian Americans is actually higher than all the other, whether U.S. born or all the other immigrants. So that's why we really felt the need that this project would definitely benefit this group. In terms of their acculturation, the reason I want to talk about this slide is that it really matters when you're trying to provide services to know when they immigrated. If they immigrated, at least 20 years ago, they're, like I said, mostly educated, proficient in English. They're, doctors, lawyers, engineers. They're middle, upper class, affluent, and they're not specifically religious, but they do have secular spiritual beliefs. And they have also integrated traditional and more modern values, and they're more bicultural. Now, if they've immigrated more recently, I would say less than 10 years, or their age at the time of immigration was more than 25, they usually have no to little English proficiency. They're mostly monolingual. They're in the service industry, small business, or much more religious, maybe practicing Muslims, and they have a lot more traditional values. But nonetheless, for all these categories that I mentioned, they are highly, highly family-oriented. They, in terms of seeking services, shaming one's family or keeping a face is very common. They don't ask for help. They don't come forward with help, and that brings us to service delivery issues and barriers to care, in specific when it comes to dementia care. So when we're talking about barriers, accessibility to care is huge because sometimes they don't even know exist. Like I said, dementia resources did not exist in Farsi at all in the United States. When we were trying to come about this project, I honestly reached out to different countries, London, Australia, Canada, to be able to find resource material. So that's how we ended up actually getting all of Alzheimer OC's training, and we're really grateful for them. They so graciously shared everything with us, and we were able to basically go ahead and translate a lot of material that just did not exist before. In terms of dementia assessment, like I said, there was nothing in Farsi, so any dementia assessment tools that they were, we had to translate. In terms of language and communication, they're not very proficient in English. There's mistrust of the government agencies. And by this, I just mean they have received information that if they ask for help or received any kind of governmental benefits such as like Medicare or Medi-Cal, they might not be able to obtain a green card or become a citizen. So that's what I mean by the mistrust, that they feel like, oh, if I get services, then I'm not going to be eligible for my citizenship or become a permanent resident. And there's a lack of knowledge. There is a lack of financial resources. We already talked about the acculturation, and then we come to stigma. So stigma is huge, and by huge, I mean this could take another whole webinar for me. But what I wanted to say is that when we talk of stigma, we're also talking about a lack of education and information that contributes to isolation and post-socialization. So the consideration for service delivery is that we at Omid started outreaching to all of the community culturally based organizations in Orange County that we either previously had a relationship with or we were working with, also stakeholders and mainstream organizations. This was extremely beneficial because now they know that there is a Farsi speaking Farsi existing program that they can refer people to. In terms of service delivery consideration with participants and their family, it's really, really important to develop rapport. Trust is built very, very slowly with this population, as I mentioned, for the mistrust that they have or other areas that they have faced. Confidentiality and boundary issues are important because you want to review that with them, that everything is confidential. Like if you are getting dementia care, of course, it's free of service at our office and we're not really reporting it to anyone, so you wouldn't be losing any benefits or you wouldn't be restrained from getting any benefits in the future. In terms of culturally sensitive assessment, it involves that immigration history again. You want to know if they have a support system in America. You want to know their family dynamics, how many caregivers are actually providing care. You know, a member comes to you and complains about maybe early memory loss, and then there's 3 caregivers with her. So you want to kind of make sure that you are not necessarily assigning a specific caregiver, but you want to make boundaries and these type of stuff very clear for them. For the adaptation of appropriate resource material, we spend a lot of time on this because we wanted to make sure that it served both of the populations that I discussed, whether they were recently immigrated or if they had immigrated long ago, more than 25 years ago. We wanted to make sure that our resource material basically was kind of streamlined so that any Persian can take it, hand out, and understand what are we talking about. We wanted to make it not too hard, not too easy. And then the cultural expectations, which also include legal and financial. In terms of the cultural expectations in service delivery, we wanted to provide education so that they can gain insight through psychoeducation. We wanted to teach them a skill on how to manage symptoms for both person living with dementia and their caregivers so that they can make informed decisions, gain knowledge of the disease and acceptance, and validation of actions and feelings. And what I mean by that is that there were some studies in Sweden, London, and Australia that even though the participant actually accepted that they might have dementia, that they might have early stage Alzheimer's disease or whatnot, it was really hard for the caregivers to accept this, usually because caregivers, like I mentioned, they're also highly educated doctors, and they kind of want to argue with you that, are you sure that my mom has this? Are you sure my dad has this? So we had to work, you know, from the mental health point of view to kind of gain that acceptance and at the same time validate their actions and feelings. So what has worked for us in terms of providing services to this population was that we soon realized that provider credentials really, really matters to this population. So if an intern comes and puts a lecture up, it doesn't have the same effect as if a doctor or an MFT or a PhD comes and give a lecture. So at Omid, we hired highly educated care managers. These are PhD either students or MFT students. We have doctors that have taught in other countries. They're university professors in Iran that moved here, but they're not licensed. So we basically hired those. In translation, we used both post-revolution and pre-revolution language. So that basically, like I said, anybody can take a handout and take a look at those. For other things that we did, we tailored the program to fit our already existing models. We used the 88, which was non-threatening. We used MoCA in cognitive screening. And then we got rid of some of the pictures, such as firearm, that didn't make sense to our community. So we were having lectures, and somebody said, well, why are there a picture of firearm there? So we basically got rid of things, small changes that had a big impact, and replaced that with a stove. We were able to train 13 gatekeepers. We were able to train 84 staff. We were able to provide 55 cognitive screening in a matter of 6 months. We enrolled 14 people in our dementia care coordination, and we trained 18 caregivers. And we also provided 115 individuals with education. And my last 2 slides is something that's a take home, and you can actually take a look at this, but I just wanted to wrap this up by saying that culturally informed and responsive care is a worldview and not a skill set. Immigrants from the Middle East are very diverse, so just get to know them, be curious, play Columbo, ask them, because each Persian American is a unique window to their own culture and a cross-section of multiple identities. And cultural adaptation of resource material and being culturally competent on more than just linguistic competency. For the sake of time, I'm wrapping this up, but if you guys have any questions, all of our information is at the end of my slides, and we will be happy to be of assistance and help to any organization that would like to learn more about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Amy, for your wonderful presentations. Both were very informative. And you'll see that you're able to download the slides on the platform you're looking at. We have a few minutes for questions. I want to point out that at the time we submitted these slides, there was a coming soon notice for a new application for the ADPI program that is now up on grants.gov. You can take a look at that and search for Alzheimer's Disease Programs Initiative. And I just wanted to ask you both, well, this question came in for Amy. If religious beliefs were have been a barrier, especially for anyone who doesn't speak English with your program.
I want to move away from thinking about the religious beliefs or cultural background as a barrier, as much as it is like we have to shift our tool from the hammer to the screwdriver. So, you know, there are different approaches that we took on depending on a person's background. But I think, just like Sarah was saying, that we should have that mindset, a worldview, and think of it as, okay, this is something that we as providers can switch tools in order to help, provide access to that person.
Great, thank you. Sarah, is there anything you want to add with relation to that question?
I actually agree, and I wanted to say, with regards to the faith communities, we actually haven't had much of a success. Sometimes it's actually a barrier to care. However, we have seen that with some faith communities, actually it helps people to have that faith piece, because it does help them. We haven't seen it to be a barrier for participants, but we've seen it being a barrier when trying to outreach to these communities to try to educate them and bring them in for help.
Great, thank you so much. So our presenters had so much wonderful information to provide to you today that we don't have much time left. I want to thank you all for joining us today at the webinar. Please come again on April 21st when we talk about dementia education for building management in the city of Chicago, where they are supporting people living with dementia where they live. So we hope to have you at that webinar as well. I will turn it back to ASA for some final remarks.
Yes, thank you all again so much for joining us. Thank you to the Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center for your partnership, and to our presenters today for the information that you provided. Just as a reminder, if you would like to claim CEUs for today's webinar, you will be receiving a follow-up email by the end of the business day today that will contain a CEU link application, and you have 60 days to complete that application, and then it may take up to 30 days for us to issue those CEUs. Thank you all again so much. Please be sure to check the ASA website to find out information about upcoming webinars, and we are very grateful. Have a great day.